Good morning and welcome to this morning's webinar, MBTA Communities Updates. I'm Dottie Fulginetti, Senior Planner with Old Colony Planning Council. On behalf of our Executive Director, Mary Waldron, and Council President, Valerie Massard, I thank you for being here on this beautiful Monday morning. This webinar will be a presentation of some updates and key dates for MBTA communities and will include plenty of time for questions. We have people joining from all over the state, so if your question is very community specific, please email your question to dhcd3a@mass.gov. Otherwise, put your questions in the Q&A and we will field them from there. This presentation is being recorded. The slides and video will be sent to everyone that registered and posted to our website. We appreciate and value your time, so I'm going to introduce Chris Clutchman and Nate Carlucci. Chris is the Deputy Director of the Community Services Division for DHCD, otherwise known as the Department of Housing and Community Development. Nate is the MBTA Community Coordinator, so we will turn it over to you, Chris.
Thank you so very much, Dottie. It's really nice to be here again on this really beautiful fall morning, and happy Halloween to everybody. I'm in costume as a DHCD regulator. Do you get it? So we're going to go through a presentation, and this is part of our tour of various regional planning agencies. There are 8 regional planning agencies that have MBTA communities. So while I do know that we have people from all over the MBTA region here today, mostly we're doing these with the RPAs and their member communities, but we're happy to have great attendance this morning. Well, we're going to go through a PowerPoint and then open it up for questions. So Nate, if you want to start sharing your screen, we'll just get started. All righty, let's just get started. Let's get started. So this is just a preview slide. This is what we hope that you're going to come away from this presentation, that you're going to be reminded about the final guidelines for Section 3A that DHCD issued in August of this year. We're going to talk about some of the tools that are forthcoming next month, and then also make sure that folks have a sense of the technical assistance resources. Next slide, please. So we talk a lot, and the Baker-Polito administration talks a lot about the housing crisis. The housing crisis that was a crisis before COVID made it even worse. Our perspective is that there is not enough supply being built to meet the demands, and therefore we are unfortunately at the top end of top housing prices across the country for both for sale and for rental prices. And so when this law was passed and the governor signed it back in January of 2021, it is a huge opportunity and for us to solve that housing crisis by allowing for transit-oriented development and setting the stage for decades to come. We really see this as a long-term process that by developing zoning and putting zoning in place, communities will remove some of the barriers that exist for folks to be building multifamily housing. Currently, multifamily is unpredictable and time-consuming, or not even allowed at all in many jurisdictions of the 175 MBTA communities. We understand that this is a new paradigm for many communities, and we hope that the discussion will continue in communities, in town meetings, in planning boards, and city and town councils across the region to talk about how housing can best be crafted for your community. And of course, what we want to do is create walkable neighborhoods, allowing multifamily near transit, but in those communities that don't have any transit, also helping to guide you to locate multifamily district in a place that makes sense and that mirrors smart development principles. Next slide, Nate. So just a quick overview of the timeline where we were back in January 2021. We issued guidance right away to let folks know that in 2021, everybody was in compliance while we developed the guidelines. We issued those draft guidelines last December and had over 90 days of a robust engagement. We had almost 400 comments. We did 24 webinars, and feedback was largely supportive, but we heard a lot from communities about some of the on-the-ground problems, and especially from smaller communities, we heard about some of the problems. So we made adjustments to the guidelines and issued them on August the 10th of this year. We have a phased rollout where we have the compliance model and other materials that will be forthcoming in November next month. And at that time will open up the actual full district compliance applications. And then you'll see a lot of deadlines later in the presentation, but January 31st, 2023 is the first deadline that's coming up for local governments for the action plans. Next. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Nate Carlucci, who's going to walk you through the requirements. Take it away, Nate.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Dottie. Good morning, everybody. So as Chris said, I'm just going to quickly walk through, or not too quickly, but walk through the basic functionality of the guidelines that DHCD has developed for this program. Before getting to the guidelines, it's helpful to go back to the statute and just sort of look at the text that exists within the statute. You essentially have one paragraph, paragraph 1 here, that describes the zoning elements of this legislation. And so the guidelines that DHCD developed are an interpretation of that one paragraph to go into tremendously more detail. And then in the rest of the statute, you have the second paragraph, which sets forth the funding sources that are at stake in terms of compliance with the statute, and the final paragraph, which tasks DHCD with developing the guidelines. So the first thing that the guidelines do is they divide the MBTA communities into 4 community categories based on their fixed transit assets. But we might ask first, what is an MBTA community? And MBTA communities are a theme that already existed in the MBTA statute, chapter 161A. There's a list of 175 communities in the MBTA service district. And you can't use this rule perfectly, but by and large, the 175 are communities that have a fixed MBTA transit asset, or they're adjacent to a community that does have one. So taking those 175 communities and trying to apply these requirements fairly to all of them required some establishment of these categories. And those category determinations were used to determine things like the size requirements for the districts at the local level. So just to go over the 4 categories, the first 2 categories are communities that do have generally fixed transit assets. They're rapid transit communities and commuter rail communities. Determining a community's category relies on a really important concept to these guidelines. That's the concept of developable station area. So you might have seen in the first iteration of the guidelines, the draft guidelines, community categories were determined based on the presence of a fixed transit station, or having one within a half mile of a community's boundary. But a better determination of an opportunity to zone for multifamily housing is actually the developable land area around a transit station. So to determine these categories, the guidelines set a threshold of 100 acres of developable station area associated with the transit station. So for example, if a community has a rapid transit station, and there are 100 acres or more of developable land area in the half-mile radius around that station, then that community is a rapid transit community. Similarly, for a commuter rail community, if you don't qualify as a rapid transit community, you do have a commuter rail station that is creating 100 acres of developable station area in that community, then it's a commuter rail community. But actually about half of all MBTA communities do not have a transit station. So there are, most of those are adjacent communities, which is a community that actually may have some developable station area, but less than 100 acres. And it is not an adjacent small town. So an adjacent small town is a adjacent community that is also meeting the definition of small town, which is less than 500 people per square mile, or a population of 7,000 year-round residents or less. So those community categories are used to determine the reasonable size requirements for these zoning districts. By and large, the rapid transit, commuter rail, and adjacent communities have a land area requirement of 50 acres. That does get adjusted for local conditions for communities that have limited total sizes or limited amounts of developable land. But for adjacent small towns, there actually is no minimum district size requirement. The size is essentially determined by the second factor, unit capacity, and meeting that unit capacity at the required gross density in the statute of 15 units per acre. Unit capacity is an important concept. It is basically the count of the units that could potentially be produced based on the zoning that's in place in the district. So as you can see, we have certain multipliers set forth in this table for unit capacity for the 4 community categories. And the way that plays out is to determine a unit capacity requirement. You multiply a community's existing housing stock from the last census by that percentage that's set forth in this table. So this essentially has greater requirements when communities have more transit assets. There are also different location requirements for these districts based on the community categories. So of course, for the rapid transit and commuter rail communities, there's a location requirement to zone at least some of this district near the transit station. We'll cover that in more detail on a following slide. For the adjacent small towns, there's no specific location requirement for the district. Finally, the other difference in these community categories is the deadline for district compliance, meaning having adopted and having approved the multifamily zoning district. So the rapid transit communities, there's only 12 of them. They have a quick deadline at the end of 2023. Most communities, commuter rail or adjacent, have until the end of 2024, and the adjacent small towns have until the end of 2025. So just to touch on unit capacity a little bit more, there have been a lot of questions about the impact of existing development in a potential new zoning district or an existing zoning district that's going to be potentially used for compliance with Section 3A. And to be as clear as possible, the measurement of unit capacity is a measurement of zoning only, and it is irrelevant what is already built there. So if a parcel of land is zoned for 15 units, then that unit capacity is 15, regardless of whether that parcel of land is vacant now or has 100 units on it. Just to touch on district location a little bit, I have a couple examples of communities to share. The first one here is Arlington, and Arlington works as a really good example for explaining developable station area as well. You can see on the map on the right, in the darker green, there's a little circle towards the bottom right of Arlington there, and that's representing the developable station area from Alewife Station in Cambridge. That's actually the only developable station area in Arlington, and it's only 58 acres. So it wasn't actually enough for Arlington to be anything other than an adjacent community. But this count of developable station area also is important to determining the location requirements for the district. So you can see on the left side of this slide, there's a table. The table on the leftmost column lists amounts of developable station area in a community. To the right of that, in the middle column, is a corresponding percentage requirement, which is the percentage of a district that must be zoned within a half mile of the fixed transit station based on the number of acres of developable station area. And when I say percentage of district, that means, for example, if you had 500 acres of developable station area, you can see on this table that would be a 50% district location requirement. That means that 50% of your district's required land area would have to be within a half mile of the transit station. and 50% of the district's minimum unit capacity would also have to be in that half mile. So I do want to emphasize that this creates a lot of flexibility, even for the rapid transit and commuter rail communities, to, if they think that they have a location that's a great location for this multifamily district and is not where the transit station is, there's a lot of opportunity to hit that location in addition to having the district near the station. So you don't have to do the whole district by the station. However, as a different example, for communities that have a tremendous amount of developable station area, this is the town of Needham here using this example. They have 4 commuter rail stations. That amounts to 1,200 acres of developable station area in Needham, and you can see on the table that that means 90% of their district has to be located in developable station areas. Just want to talk quickly about what the definition of multifamily housing is, and you can meet that definition in 2 ways with 2 types of buildings. One is with a building with 3 or more residential dwelling units, but the other is actually having 2 duplexes on the same lot. This is the definition of multifamily housing from the Zoning Act. And so, of course, with 3A, you can meet the definition with either of those 2 building types. But I also want to talk about what you should picture when you think about the multifamily housing that's required under the statute and under these guidelines. It's missing middle housing. So on the graphic on the bottom of this slide, you can see the detached single family houses on the left, but you also see these mid-rise buildings on the right. When we're talking about 15 units per acre and we're talking about these definitions of multifamily housing, it's everything here in the middle that is the type of development that is actually required. That's a really good visual way to sort of envision what the actual physical development might look like based on the zoning requirements that are out there. Talking a little bit about as of right zoning requirements in Section 3A. Of course, the statute requires that the multifamily housing be allowed in the district as of right, and there are a lot of questions about what it means to be as of right. A popular question has been site plan review, and the guidelines in their final form do clarify that site plan review is allowed in an as of right multifamily zoning district, as long as the requirements in site plan review are reasonable, essentially that they don't amount to a discretionary permit. Affordability, you may have heard there were some revisions made on Friday, the 21st of October, very recently, to expand communities' ability to require affordable units in these zoning districts. So with the new requirements, any community in their district can require up to 10% of units to be affordable at 80% AMI. That's just automatically acceptable for as of right zoning under Section 3A under our guidelines. There are some exceptions in place now to allow MBTA communities to actually require more affordable units or to have AMI below 80%. But in order to do that, there needs to be a feasibility analysis completed by a qualified third party and approved by DHCD that essentially is going to show that it is economically feasible for the district to have those requirements in place. There are also exceptions in place for DHCD programs such as Chapter 40R, and that will allow you to go up to 20% for either of those exceptions. 20% of units can be affordable. Mandatory mixed use development, it can be a popular tool at the local level, particularly around a village center or a downtown, where having a mandatory retail component for residential development helps you get that district that you're looking for. But in the statute here, the requirement is actually that multifamily housing be allowed as of right. So this is a requirement in the statute rather than the guidelines that mandatory mixed use is not consistent with Section 3A. So the district can allow mixed use development. It can even incentivize mixed use development, but that retail component cannot be mandatory. If it's critical to have that mandatory mixed use, you can have a different district address the housing primarily in the 3A district and have a different district in the same neighborhood that has the mandatory mixed use requirement. And finally, energy efficiency, a pretty light rule here, but it's just that energy efficiency standards cannot be higher for multifamily housing than they are for other uses in the municipality. So for example, if it's required for multifamily, it has to also be required for single family. This is just a little bit more information on those changes that we made to the affordability requirements. And this is clarifying again, just to restate that inclusionary zoning can require up to 10% of units to be affordable at AMI, 80 AMI in any district. And for the DHCD programs exception, you can go up to 20% of units as affordable and below 80% if the district is reviewed and approved by another DHCD program. There's actually a greater exception for an existing 40R district to go up to 25% affordable units if they had that rule in place already. And again, that's that exception up to 20% affordable and below 80% AMI is also allowed with the feasibility analysis by a third party. We also made an adjustment to a requirement that had previously required units to be eligible for the subsidized housing inventory, but we removed that requirement in order to allow communities to actually have an AMI over 80%. So here I just want to recap restate the timelines that we went over on a previous slide. Again, most communities, commuter rail and adjacent communities have until the end of 2024 to have compliant districts adopted. Before the district compliance deadline, we have created opportunities to achieve interim compliance with the statute. Last year in 2022, communities could be compliant by just submitting a community information form that many of you might remember. And there was a lot of success with that. 166 of the 175 MBTA communities did submit that form and comply for 2022. Now in this year, 2023, there's an action plan required to comply. That action plan is due at the end of January of 2023 for every community category. If you haven't looked at it already, I encourage you to go on to our website, mass.gov/MBTA communities, and take a look at that action plan. It's really a light lift. It's more of a form than a plan, but it does get communities thinking about potential strategies for compliance. And it does ask some questions about the schedule for the plan for how a community is going to strategize a process for developing compliant zoning. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris.
Thanks so much, Nate. Let's go to the next slide. I should mention that we're going to be sharing this PowerPoint in a PDF format, and so Dottie will be posting it on the Old Colony Planning Commission's website, so it'll be available to you. We do understand this is a very dense presentation, so hopefully people understood that intuitively. So a couple things just to talk about what is going to be forthcoming in the next month, and an important piece that you've heard Nate talk about in order to measure unit capacity, to provide for us the size of the district and to provide the overall density for a district. There will be all communities will be required to fill out something called the compliance model, which has several different pieces to it. One is a land database, a GIS database, and this will be provided for every community. For every parcel in every community, you will get a GIS base map that identifies developable land, excluded land, sensitive land, and that will be the basis of what each community can use. Some communities have GIS expertise in-house and some will need consultant or RPA assistance. But essentially, and then the next piece of the compliance model is a checklist that's embedded into an Excel workbook that communities will fill out to reflect the zoning that they're proposing. This can also be used to develop a variety of scenarios that you might want to test to see how they come out in terms of unit capacity as you're thinking about different metrics in your zoning. For example, reducing a minimum lot size may really give you a lot more unit capacity. Adjusting to allow higher heights may give you a higher unit capacity. You may want to have a variety of densities in your, like, sub-districts in your MBTA district. So this will allow you to input the metrics from your zoning, specific metrics from the zoning bylaw or ordinance that's being developed. And then it will result in this estimator. We want to make sure folks know this is just an estimate, for the purposes of complying with this program. But it is kind of a cool process, and we're really pretty proud of it. And it will come out in November with detailed webinars and user information. But essentially, you're going to draw a district, clip it in a GIS program that will export all the parcels that are within that district area, and then you'll run it through this Excel workbook that will come up with the results that you see, like, for example, in the little spreadsheet sample on the right-hand side. Next slide. And then in terms of technical assistance, I just want to make it clear that it is the administration's goal, and we're working very closely with partners to provide technical assistance to every community that wants it. We think that it's possible that people will come in for technical assistance a couple different times. They may look to their regional planning agency for help with the action plan. They may look to a mass housing partnership consultant for help with the compliance model, and they may receive funding from a DHCD program to hire a consultant to actually develop zoning language. They may get more assistance from folks when you have zoning and you need to turn to public engagement and really a campaign that you might want to work with your community to get input. Or you may have that public input at a couple different times in your process. So I want to point out a couple things. Nate has gone through in exquisite detail how to fill out an action plan in a webinar from Mass Housing Partnership on October 19th that was recorded. So you can go to their website to look at that, his portion of that presentation, if you have questions about the action plan. We're developing a sample zoning bylaw and ordinance that'll be available that folks may use in whole, or they may take modules of it. And then finally, we're working on a user guide that's a little bit more narrative than just the guidelines, and comes at it from like a little perspective of what are the basic building blocks that we need to start with: location, size, compliance model, etc. Next slide. Thank you. And then finally, this is a slide that shows all of the available TA resources that we are coordinating. Again, we're working very closely with our RPA partners on DLTA funding. Some of them are technical assistance providers that are eligible to be used as consultants, both by local governments, because you don't need to use a procurement when you hire your regional planning agency. Some of them are also can receive funding from Community One-Stop Resources, which is the DHCD programs, or Mass Housing Partnership. Also, EEA, the Land Use Planning Grant Program, is funding some compliance activities. So in the Community One-Stop, we just announced this week, there are 14 communities that applied for funding to help with compliance, and we gave funding to all 14 of those. So those folks will be starting their process soon, and that one-stop process will open up again next spring. I think that's it, Nate, and I think we're ready to open it up for questions. Oh, just to bring it home, we hope that through this presentation, you've received the information that we started out with as our goal, more about the guidelines, a deeper dive, a preview of the tools, and an overview of the TA resources. And now I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thanks, Chris. The first question we have is from Margaret Hoffman, and they ask, why is Avon excluded?
So I can't tell you the total reason, but they are not listed in MGL chapter 161A that Nate mentioned, which lists all the MBTA service district, and they just are not part of that. I can't tell you why, but I can tell you the fact is that they're not part of that list, and that's why they're not an MBTA community.
Right. So MBTA communities that have been identified for a long time now, that before this even happened, those communities pay into the MBTA funds through their cherry sheet. And so that is really a designation that happened long before this MBTA communities program. Avon's very small. I think it's about 2,400 acres or less. So I thought that probably has something to do with the size. Our next question is from Abby McCabe. Abby's question is the size of the contiguous area for the zoning district's land area. For Lexington, an adjacent community will have to have at least 50 acres and a housing capacity of 1,231 units, but she's not sure the minimum size of the contiguous land area. She thought it would be 25 acres contiguous, but a planning board member thinks it's 41.
Thanks for your question, Abby. Nate, do you want to try and take this? While you were speaking, I did have a time to do a little research on Lexington.
Okay, so Chris has a little more research on Lexington specifically done, but I think, speak to the requirement that's in the guidelines. The actual requirement is that 1/2 of the total district land area is contiguous. So if Lexington were to meet their land area requirement, I'm just going to guess it's 50 acres. If your district was exactly 50 acres, then 25 acres would have to be contiguous. But if they decided to make a 100-acre district, then 50 acres would have to be contiguous.
Correct. So just to be clear, and this is found in section 5 of the guidelines. So again, we have a minimum land area requirement. That's the floor for the district size. However, it is our understanding that districts may have to be a little bit bigger in order to meet specific unit capacity goals. So again, if your district it's not based on the minimum land area, it's based on the actual size of the district. And Abby, I hope that answers your question.
Terrific. Josh Lee asks, is the map showing developable land and developable station area available for all MBTA communities?
It will be released when the compliance model is released. And so all 170, so we'll have basically communities will be able to download this GIS map layer, and that will show the developable land area, and that will come when the compliance model is released.
Perfect. Amanda Chiancola says, is there a list of qualified third-party consultants that have been approved by DHCD to complete the feasibility analysis?
The economic feasibility analysis. No, Amanda, we don't have pre-qualified list, although there is a new state vendor list of professional services that now includes a whole variety of planning expertise. I will try and put that link into the chat, which will be a link to the user's guide for the Combis system and for that particular set of professional services providers. They have just been selected this summer, and I believe most of them are going under contract. Municipalities can use that, and I would just direct you to, and so there's planning services, GIS services, economic development, market analysis, civil engineering. There are a whole list of consultants that may be able to provide that information on the economic feasibility analysis. And again, I just put you to your own procurement officer in your community about how you would use that state vendor list. We will be coming out with some more information about the economic feasibility analysis that's been mentioned in the small revisions that we made to the affordability section in section 4B of the guidelines. We'll come out with more information about exactly what is the criteria for an economic feasibility analysis when we put out everything in November.
That's great. I think that might have actually answered a couple questions down. Amanda had a follow-up question. For the economic feasibility analysis, the guidelines require that the methodology and format be acceptable to DHCD. Is there a standard methodology and format, and what is the review process?
We're going to put out more information on that. It's more to come.
Great. We have an anonymous attendee asking if a community does not have inclusionary zoning bylaw in place now, can they add it to the new overlay district regs?
I could take that one. Yes, it would have to meet the criteria that we outlined, of course. And again, that any community can have a requirement for 80% AMI with 10% of the units in the district. And then you can also have a greater affordability requirement by meeting one of those exceptions, either going through a DHCD program such as 40R or by submitting the economic feasibility analysis.
Thanks. That was a great question and a big question of a lot of our communities about the affordability. So I'm really glad that communities are thinking about affordability as part of their planning process on this. Katie Lacey from Mass Housing Partnership just made a comment. Thanks for the great, clear overview. And I just want to give her a shout out back. She is doing great work with Mass Housing Partnership, the technical assistance. Their website has lots of information. I put it in a link to this invitation, but it will send out information as a follow-up reminder as well. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Workforce housing is mentioned in the revisions dated October 21st, but it's not defined in the guidelines. Is it up to the individual communities to define this in the new zone?
So I'll take that one. This is not a requirement. As Dottie said, we would like to encourage folks to pursue required affordability through inclusionary zoning. But the workforce housing reference is meant to be clear that we are, with this change, we are now allowing affordability requirements that might be more than 80% of area median income. In order to qualify for the subsidized housing inventory, inclusionary zoning would require 80% or less of the area median income for income requirements. But the new guidelines also make it clear that you can, so some communities would like to offer what is often called workforce housing that might be at 100% of AMI or 120% of AMI or some variety above AMI, but they want that to be restricted to that particular income limit. So that is what is meant by workforce housing.
And there's a follow-up question on that. The revision stated October 21st mentions the 80% AMI. Is this the number we're using for the specific individual community or the regional number? So that is the individual community, correct?
Yes.
Be the same as the regional?
Yes, yes. If you would like to have an inclusionary zoning component, as Nate said, you can do 10% at 80% of AMI, just without further process or review or justification. If you would like to do more than 10% of the units or deeper affordability at less than 80% of AMI, then you have to do an economic you have to provide the economic feasibility analysis to show that that wouldn't harm production. So hopefully that's clear.
And another question from Dylan Sussman. Does the multifamily district have to be contiguous?
I'll let Nate take that.
Sure. So there are a couple requirements in place regarding contiguity. So the whole district does not need to be contiguous. There's a requirement that one half of the total district has to be contiguous. And then for the rest of the district, the only requirement is that any piece has to be a minimum of 5 acres in order to qualify towards meeting the minimum land area requirement. So basically, that requirement is to discourage zoning individual parcels scattered about town, but to kind of plan a neighborhood scale zoning district. So one half of it contiguous, the rest of the pieces just have to be a minimum of 5 acres contributing towards the minimum land area requirement.
Perfect. Another question, will the addition of this zone and the development of these units increase the threshold for the number of affordable units needed in a community?
So I'll take that. Just adopting a zoning district does not change your SHI requirement. I think this is referring to the 40B requirement of 10%, and it's asking about the denominator in that, and which is the number of total household units that are in a community based on the decennial census. So that right now, the 2020 decennial census has not put out its year-round housing units. And so we are waiting for that number from the census. So that will be in place from the 2020 census. So the only thing that would change the SHI percentage requirement would be if you adopted your district and you had development and you did not have an inclusionary zoning requirement to require those units to be affordable. And by 2030, your denominator will have increased. That is the next time that the SHI denominator will be looked at. It's in 2030. So one of the reasons that we've put forward the allowance of without justification of allowing up to 10% of units to be required to be affordable at 80% of the AMI is in order to hold yourself harmless. If you do get development and you have that provision in your zoning bylaw, then you should be protected from any increase in units, because increase in units will be matched with 10% of those units being affordable. So that is, again, we could get into a lot of details about how to be strategic, about how these requirements relate to Chapter 40B, but that is ostensibly one of the reasons that we put that forward. But again, just developing the zoning does not change the number of housing units you have in your community. It's only if those units get built, and the next time the SHI will be adjusted will be the 2030 decennial census.
And another question is, are there any incentives for developers to build affordable housing?
We hope that local governments will add incentives in their inclusionary zoning bylaws. We think it's a best practice to add density bonuses for folks that add inclusionary units. You do not have to do that, but we do think that that's a good practice. And so that right there, that would be at the local option for you to encourage affordable units by adding rewards, by increasing the density or other flexibility in the development of those units. As folks may know, there are many different programs that fund subsidize affordable projects. And so those exist and those will continue to exist.
I would add from my perspective, one of the things that our community looks at is community preservation funds. And if you are a CPC community, sometimes you can use some of those funds to help offset or subsidize some of those units. Might be something to think about. Let me see. Will the community be deemed compliant if all zoning changes have been presented in good faith to town meeting, but it's ultimately defeated?
No, the zoning must be adopted and the compliance model filled out and submitted, but it has to be an adopted zoning bylaw or ordinance in order to be compliant.
Okay. And Chris Ryan adds, tying minimum contiguous to total district size encourages communities to limit the district size to the minimum required size.
Yes, that's a fact. I think that local, what we want to encourage local governments to look at is what fits best for your community. What are the areas? Those may be specifically exactly the minimum, but in order to reach your unit capacity, you may need to have a variety of different zoning. You may need to go beyond 15 acres, 15 units per acre in order to, and to fit your unit capacity into your minimum land area. It just is going to be really different for each community.
And that really is a proactive planning approach. To be thinking about that always. It feels like sometimes we look at like just checking off the box or trying to pass the test, but a lot of communities like the one that I live in have been proactively planning before. So you kind of probably have already, a lot of communities doing most of the work where you know where those sections are going to be located. Harry LaCortia, I'm sorry, I didn't pronounce that right. La Cortiglia. Does Section 2 definitions of the compliance guideline for multifamily zoning districts under Section A of the Zoning Act also include within the definition of excluded land, Mass General Law, Chapter 61, 61A, and 61B lands?
Nate, you want to take that one?
Apologies, I don't remember on the spot exactly whether they're included. We can look it up real quickly.
I don't think they're included.
We can follow up with that one.
Yeah.
Kind of a little bit more of a deeper dive. We have another question. We can have multiple districts that add up to the amount needed, correct? And I think that we did answer
yes.
that.
Yes. And just to be clear, again, you want to be thinking about the district locations. Let's say you have one overlay district and a portion of it is around a transit facility, you can also have that same overlay district that applies to a different part of your community. But you have to take in mind those the minimum contiguous area requirements. But yes, you can have more than 2 if you wanted to, as long as you're meeting the minimum contiguity requirements.
Sure. And Paige Duncan asks about the compliance model in November. Are we looking at the beginning of November, the middle of November, the end of November? We're eager.
We're shooting not for the end of, we're shooting for before Thanksgiving, but we're working our hardest to get everything completed.
Great, thank you. And Alicia Hunt asks, can you have different zones with different heights, setbacks, et cetera, that add up to comply? That is, do the different pieces have the same dimensional and/or other requirements?
You can absolutely do that as long as the district as a whole passes the required zoning metrics. So one thing to keep in mind, for example, the district as a whole has to meet the gross density of 15 units an acre. That means that part of your district could be less than 15 and another part of the district could be more than 15. And whether that's achieved with use regulations or dimensional regulations doesn't matter, as long as the entire district as a whole meets the required metrics.
Terrific. And Harry put his email in the Q&A for follow-up, and we'll record.
Thank you, Harry.
Any other comments or questions? We're 10 minutes of 11, so this was really like a speed presentation. I know that some communities have different levels of how much they've participated in all the webinars. I think that you've done a great job with having a lot of webinars available, and even on the Mass Housing Partnership website, there's a list of the recorded webinars. We'll just give one more opportunity if there's any other questions, and then I will wrap up. I don't see anything else. Chris and Nate, did you have anything you wanted to say as your closing comments?
I don't. I hope people are rolling up their sleeves and kind of starting to dig into this. We are going to continue to put out, as I mentioned, these additional resources. We're continuing to work with our regional planning agencies, and Dottie, we're so grateful for your help and coordination in getting those RPAs ready to help their communities. So it's our job to train some of the RPA staff to make sure, in future, if you have questions, you can start with Dottie, and if Dottie couldn't answer, then you can come to us. I don't know, Dottie, if you put the dhcd3a@mass.gov email in the chat, but that is, it's the dhcd3a@mass.gov. We're endeavoring to answer those questions. Sometimes it can take us a little bit, but it really helps us to have particular questions. Some of them need a Teams meeting and feedback from our partners and our colleagues. Some of them are more simple. And so we appreciate your patience as we are attending to all of those questions.
Terrific. Well, Chris and Nate, we thank you for your leadership on the MBTA community's guidance. And we also thank our cities and towns for their efforts in trying to help solve the housing crisis in Massachusetts by making our communities welcoming and accessible to young people, families, children, older adults, people with disabilities, and those that are struggling to find housing. This concludes our webinar. We thank you for attending, and we encourage you to continue asking questions, request technical assistance, and reach out to your local regional planning agencies and other partners like Mass Housing Partnership for additional help. So everyone have a great and productive week. Thank you.